So we've been talking throughout today about the role that the US government plays in technology markets, and we're going to continue that overall discussion from a new lens by turning our attention overseas for our panel on keeping America's lead, China, economic statecraft, and US technology markets. I'm very excited to introduce our two panelists. Matt Turpin has been at the center of US policymaking when it comes to China, having served as China director for the White House National Security Council under President Trump and as China advisor to the Secretary of Commerce. Matt's also been on the ground in the military for 22 years, including as the chief of crisis planning for 3 years at the US Pacific Command. So thank you very much, Matt, for being here. Dr. Chris Ford has similarly spent his career operating at the highest levels of US foreign policy. During the Trump administration, he served as Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation, and like Matt, served at the White House National Security Council, where he focused on weapons of mass destruction and counterproliferation. Earlier in his career, he worked at the State Department on similar issues under President George W. Bush. Thank you both very much for being here.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. So you hear people talk all the time about our American competition with China, whether it's politicians or commentators. 10 years ago, it was focused on manufacturing and China's manufacturing prowess. Today, it's just as often focused on cybersecurity and critical minerals and a variety of other areas. But it's not always easy to get a sense of what exactly is this competition, on which dimensions is it occurring, what would winning look like, what does each side want to achieve? And so we'll try to ground the discussion first in understanding who are the different actors and how are they competing, what do they care about. So Matt, I'll turn it over to you in a second to help us ground that discussion by asking, what is China's perspective here when it comes to international competition? What tools are they using, and what are their goals? What would it look like if they win?
Yep. Well, Harrison, first, thanks so much for having me. Real pleasure to be up with everybody. I think, I first would start with, both the United States and China have had sort of differing visions of how they want the world to work. And for the longest period of time, the United States pursued a set of policies which, in terms of shorthand, we call engagement, which is the idea of using economic development to drive political liberalization in China. That had been really from the beginning of the Clinton administration, after the Cold War, through about the last 2 years, the Obama administration had been kind of the U.S. policy. And during that same time, China had a set of policies was about how does it help China become a more technologically, economically advanced economy and drive greater wealth to its own citizens. And so for a long period of time, you had sort of the convergence of U.S. policy, right? It sought to make the Chinese economy work better, be more advanced. We had an assumption about what would happen from that. And you had a set of Chinese leaders who wanted many of the same things, and they had a different outcome of what they wanted to be able to have happen from that. They did not want to see that political liberalization come about. And so we came to a sort of a head really about near the end of the Obama administration of an assessment from the U.S. perspective that while we were being incredibly successful at driving economic development in China, we were seeing backsliding on the political liberalization side, and our national security and human rights issues were becoming more acute. And that generated a change in U.S. policy. And I thought it was actually quite telling to have the discussions we've just had of the last two individuals that talked about competition policy. Because I was feeling that there was a bit of an alternative reality. That's essentially what I've been dealing with for the last 15 years is competition policy, but in a national security sense, not in a domestic sort of competitive economic sense. And so there's sort of an overlap of language there. And so I would hear my successors use a lot of language that I was familiar with, but it was manifesting itself in very different ways. And so I think we should be very clear that from China's perspective, the international system that it has found itself rise up in is something that is designed to undermine the regime of the Chinese Communist Party, right? So they believe that the international order and the rules that are set up as it exists right now are designed to undermine them. And I want to tell you, I think they're right. We did set up an international order to undermine authoritarian regimes, right? Let's just be very honest about that. That's what we try to do. And to be honest about our own policy was, we want to help you get richer with the assumption that your citizens are going to ask for greater political rights, and it will moderate the leadership's behavior, right? That was our thesis, and it's what we're trying to do. And China understands that completely and and the Chinese leaders don't want that to come about. And so we find ourselves in a rivalry in ways that I think is difficult to contemplate from a U.S. perspective, because we think that those rivalries are gone. They're sort of a relic of an old time, but they're back full force. And it's what I found, we were discussing before we came up, is that the language that our predecessor, or our folks that are working sort of domestic policy, that their actions have impacts on that other competition that's happening.
Yeah. So from here on out, what is China trying to achieve, and how are they trying to achieve it?
I think it's pretty clear they want an international order that is not only neutral to their regime type, but advantages their regime type, right? So they want to see a world where there is less transparency of what governments do, right? Where there is a less demand that democratic institutions are the legitimate ones, and those leaders who are not democratically elected, are seen as less legitimate. They want to overturn that system and create for themselves an international order in which I think that the systems that we all have become quite comfortable with are at a disadvantage, right? That's what they would like to see. And they believe that they can achieve that through the accumulation of sort of what they would call comprehensive national power. Much of that is dependent upon an economic, commercial, technological, and industrial base that I think we should be very clear is extremely significant right now, right? They are the world's manufacturing hub in ways that, 80 years ago, we occupied that position. They now occupy that position.
Yeah, and if I might, I think it's also, looking back historically to get a feel for sort of what is the sort of the motor behind this thinking in Chinese strategy. And I think it's worth stressing how for years and years and years now, there's been a steady through line in how successive Chinese leaders have thought about the international environment and grand strategy, even though the motive behind that has manifested in different ways, right? So I think to understand this, you need to go back maybe to the mid-19th century. So if you'd gone back to the mid-18th century, Europeans looked on the Qing dynasty with to some degree of awe. This was an incredibly glorious, amazing, sophisticated, and wealthy empire. They desperately wanted the trading goods that only China could produce. 100 years later, say 1850, everything completely reversed. And what happened? What happened was the Industrial Revolution. You had Europe that became, by the early 19th century, supercharged by, first the Scientific Revolution in the 16th century, then the Enlightenment in the 17th century, then the Enlightenment in the 18th century, and then the Industrial Revolution at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th. And all this turned everything around. And by the mid-19th century, China, this sort of decrepit, ossifying Qing dynasty, kind of ran headlong into this buzzsaw of civilizational overmatch, not just extra military power, right? China had encountered barbarian peoples who were more powerful than it was before a couple of times, right? The Mongols and the Manchus both took over and ruled China for a while.
They were ruling at the time,
yeah. Incorporating China into their multinational empires. But by the mid-19th century, all of a sudden China encountered a civilization in Western Europe, with Britain as kind of like the first mover, with its first mover advantage in the Industrial Revolution, that overmatched China in not just in military terms, although that was certainly true in the era of railways and steamships and armor-plated steamships with cannon and modern weaponry and this kind of thing. It wasn't just military. It was essentially across the board. It was full spectrum overmatch, economic sophistication, dynamism, and wealth and power. By that point, with the growth of modern industry, it was science and technology, medicine, politics, culture. The self-confidence and the dynamism of this sort of supercharged early 19th century Europe ran headlong into the ancient imperial conceits of Chinese sort of Middle Kingdom centrality, and the bruise that left on the collective psyche was huge. And I offer this history lesson because I think that's kind of the shadow that cast a shadow on all of Chinese grand strategy ever since, because the ambition of all of what we see coming out of China in successive regimes, the nationalists, the communists under Mao Zedong, the Deng Xiaoping era, and now more recently all the way to Xi Jinping, the leitmotif there is the need to rectify the humiliation of that civilizational overmatch and to bring China back into something that looks and feels a little bit more like that position of civilizational centrality that they sort of romanticize in their own past. And Mao wanted to do this by revolutionary rectitude and like leading a peasant revolution around the world. Didn't work. Deng Xiaoping looked at this and said, oh crap, that didn't work. We're still poor and messed up and we have lots of problems. So we're going to adopt an export-driven growth and technology acquisition strategy. I want to learn modernity from the Asian tigers, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, right? And become strong and powerful that way. But at least initially, keep a low profile strategically because we don't want to, we need access to technology and markets and things for that strategy becoming powerful to work. And then more recently, they decided they don't need to be quite so keep their head down anymore. But
I think it's important.
It's constant.
I think it's important that meta narrative of humiliation is a narrative that the current set of Chinese leaders have absolutely amplified, largely to benefit their own position and building out a nationalist narrative. Right?
Well,
it's really about that. We really saw an uptick in that narrative just in the past 15 years. And in fact, during the period of like Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s and the 1990s, that was not the narrative they were using. And so it's been very much about how does the party use its own history and how its own interpretation of history to the Chinese people and broadcast that to the world to justify actions that they're taking in terms of their own accumulation of power.
It's interesting also that in this mode, as Matt, you were describing, where the system has sort of been set up for China to fail, they've actually been quite successful in the last several decades at the same time as this narrative of humiliation is.
Well, the differentiation between China failing and the Chinese Communist Party failing, right? So I think from a U.S. perspective, a U.S. policy perspective, the United States actually believes that the system that it's set up is going to do enormous advantage for the Chinese people.
It has already.
And it has already, right? The losers are really the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese political elites who would have less relative power in comparison to their citizens than if they remain in power, right? So the winning and losing is really through the lens of elite political leadership, not through the lens of the Chinese people. Right, and that I think that's what generates the sort of the fixation on a humiliation and a civilizational humiliation, because of course the Chinese leadership has to ensure the Chinese people understand that this is really against them as Chinese, as opposed to really an objection to a political system that is quite harmful and creates anti-competitive behaviors and a whole bunch of other harms.
Yeah,
so that's actually a great transition to the U.S. perspective. I think, in recognizing the Chinese perspective is somewhat complicated, and there's some tensions in there, but depending on which party within China you're talking about, whether it's the political elite or the average citizen. Chris, I'd be curious for your thoughts on. It seems like there's been a shift in U.S. policy over the last two administrations, starting with the Trump administration, now with the Biden administration, where, to bring us back up to speed from the history, I think the U.S. has recognized that China is no longer a source of cheap goods, but rather a real competitor. So I'd just be curious to hear, how did that transition occur seemingly 8 years ago, and what's the current view?
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of it was simply the accumulated momentum of all of these developments that we've been describing. I mean, there was sort of pressure growing on what was a sort of a consensus policy for a long period of time. I see sort of U.S. policy vis-a-vis China going through several phases, right? Back in the really early days, I mean, you go back to the early 60s, this was the U.S. policymakers looked at China as kind of the original rogue regime. Crazy, wild revolutionary who acquires nuclear weapons, right? Culture revolution stuff, right? So they were sort of like the rogue regime, like 1.0, before we worried about Iran's and North Korea's and all that sort of stuff. And then they became the card that we would play against the Soviets after they had a falling out with Moscow, and it was a very poisonous rivalry. And indeed, they were sort of shooting at each other up in the north for a little bit there at the end of the 60s. So they were something we could leverage against our big competitive rival, the Soviet Union. And then after the end of the Cold War, we looked at the way that Eastern Europe had sort of crumbled and all. It turns out, oh my goodness, all the Eastern Europeans just want to be like us. So that must be true of Chinese too. And to some degree, I mean, it wasn't crazy, right? You saw a Statue of Liberty, paper mache, iconography on Tiananmen Square before they were all butchered by the PLA. So the idea that the Chinese people just wanted to be citizens of a liberal democracy, wasn't a crazy thought, but that became kind of the consensus view of U.S. policy, which had a lot of sticking power. Things change slowly at that kind of, it's a Kuhnian paradigm of sorts that needs to get rattled before it can break. And the cumulative weight of Chinese behavior, and I think the cumulative failures of U.S. business in dealing with China, right? I remember doing interviews for one of my books on China. Even at that point in the early, the late aughts and the early teens, Western businesses in China still had this idea that, oh well, yes, we know that they're accessing all of the IP, they're stealing stuff like crazy, they're going to reverse engineer everything that we build, but we're so clever and they really can't innovate. We're always going to be a step ahead of them, even though they're going to do all that at the same time. So the assumption that we could sort of manage and ride this tiger successfully, well, I mean, there are a lot of gravestones that have that as their epitaph, right?
There were a lot of folks that believed that until they went bankrupt.
Yeah. So I think
Motorola, is a great example.
So there's an accumulated weight of like, goodness, so you go from the rogue regime to the card against the Soviets to the embrace the troubled modernizer and help them reform themselves, and then to the fourth phase of like, oh my God, what have we done? And we're in that what have we done phase, and it took a while for the policy community to kind of recognize that. Yeah. As recently as 2015, the Obama administration re-upped a technology sharing agreement so that we could share more civil nuclear power production technology with China.
So was there a specific trigger that occurred in 2015, 2016? I mean,
it was the disruption. It was the disruption opportunities of the Trump administration to some degree. This was not for better or for worse, came in without a fixed attachment to anything from before, which made it more amenable to redirection in this respect. And some of us were very eager to grab some of those reins. But
so I mean, I occupied the seat of the U.S. military at the National Security Council for the last 4 years of the Obama administration, and then sort of the first 3 years of the Trump administration. And internally inside the Obama administration, some things came to a head. Largely, the expectation around Chinese economic reforms that were announced in the fall of 2013, that by the summer of 2015 had not culminated and were going in reverse. And so essentially what you had in the summer of 15 into the fall of 2015, a policy debate within the Obama administration that perhaps our expectations and of what we had wanted to see with China is not coming about, and we need to contemplate a shift to what we would call strategic competition. And I spent a lot of time, so once Secretary Clinton became candidate Clinton, spent a lot of time working with her transition team, folks that like Jake Sullivan, Michelle Flournoy, Kurt Campbell, right? All people that began into the Biden administration to conduct these policies had all been coming up with the plans of how they would transition U.S. policy to strategic competition once Hillary Clinton won the presidency in November of 2016, and we would then see that policy change, right? Essentially, that was the consensus of what we thought would happen in the fall of 2016, and obviously that wasn't the outcome of the election. But in many ways, the policy change was the same policy change. Because essentially, the logic of why the US would change its position was not relevant to the parties. It was a logic you would arrive at looking at the facts that you look at. And it had a lot to do with a judgment about the directionality of the Chinese economy and the Chinese leadership that had to do with the first 2 years of Xi Jinping's rule.
And some of it was very explicit, right? I mean, you may recall that the National Defense Strategy that was published in 2018 explicitly said that after 20 years of warfare in the Middle East and focus upon counterterrorism, explicitly said that great power competition comma, not terrorism, comma, is now the central focus of U.S. defense planning. The national security strategy that was published in late 17 said a similar sort of thing at a higher level. So there was an effort to sort of give that kind of commander's intent guidance to the bureaucracy that, hey, this is a different game now. And so one of the things that people like I did in my area in the State Department was try to figure out how to re-engineer what we did in order to support great power competitive strategy. And that was done in lots of different loci all around the system.
And it's interesting to hear you both describe what was happening around 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, insofar as there were a lot of shifts in the world that occurred, not only shifts in U.S. domestic policy or politics that help explain why the U.S. policy with regard to China has remained relatively consistent across the Trump administration and the Biden administration, at least to my understanding. And I think, in fact, some might argue that one of the Trump administration's stickiest legacies has been how we sort of treat China insofar as it's remained.
I was quite afraid that it wouldn't be that way. I had this sort of nightmare when I was, sort of rounding up my term in office that, in a very typical Washington kind of way, the successors, whoever they would be, would throw out all of these changes. I mean, we spent a lot of time on national security export controls and beginning to dabble in industrial policy, encouraging TSMC to open up semiconductor chip fabs in Arizona, for instance. So some of the things that the Biden administration ended up, taking the baton and running with were things that we were really not sure what was going to happen with those. But it turns out that this is, in fact, the new normal in the policy community, which I think is an important message for our colleagues in China to hear.
Yeah, I had the same questions, and then as I saw, certain individuals get named for positions in November and December of 2020, and then January of 2021. As the Biden team rounded itself out, Jake Sullivan became named as National Security Advisor. I understood everything that he'd written on this, and he had written on these topics quite often, and had been, in many ways, not necessarily a cheerleader for what the Trump administration was doing, but was advocating things and writing things that were very much in line with those policies. Once I saw Kirk Campbell named as the Indo-Pacific coordinator at the White House, then all of a sudden all those things sort of fell in, that if those are the people being hired for these jobs, well, then we know the directionality that it's going to go. And I think fundamentally, as we look at sort of what happens next Tuesday, I think for all of you, as you look at and perceive what is going to happen into the future, I mean, it's an old trope, but people as policy. As soon as you start to understand the individuals that are being named to different positions, whether it's a Trump administration or a Harris administration, you have some idea of the directionality that those things are going to go. I hope for a degree of continuity. I am less certain about what a Harris team would look like on these issues. I was very certain about what a Biden team would look like, but I don't know what a Harris team looks like.
Well, that's a perfect segue to, as we look out over the next 4 years, and maybe initially we could leave politics aside as much as we can. How do you think, what are the tools that we potentially have at our disposal? How, at a generic bipartisan level, how do we look out at the future with regard to our competition with China? And how do you both think about how to prioritize amongst the goals that we could set, the tools that we could deploy?
Well, we have a sort of a case study that's underway, right? I mean, with great fanfare, the so-called Chips and Science Act in 2022 was an effort to try to explore, with great bipartisan support, and throw some non-trivial money after it, what we could do to essentially encourage more innovation in key strategically important emerging technology areas. Chips gets the most attention, semiconductors, but there are other aspects of this as well, setting up an entire new piece of the National Science Foundation to steer money to areas that seem particularly promising. It's an experiment. We've not really done that sort of thing in that way very much or very well in the past. It's not a given that we'll succeed, but it had a lot of bipartisan support, and we're sort of watching to see where it goes. When I was at the State Department, we spent a lot of time, let me back up. So, strategic competition, there are no absolute static answers, right? It's imagine you're in a race with somebody.
Competitive dynamics.
Competitive dynamics, and so part of what we were working on in my portfolio was like throwing little spiky things onto the track in front of the other guy to slow him down. But we recognize, this national security technology denial. We're cutting off access to, design software for high-end chips. We're, changing the foreign direct product rule for things so we get more hooks into being able to control what others export to China's innovation sector. putting Huawei on the entity list and all this kind of stuff. So we were trying to slow them down, but we recognized completely that that's only part of the game. The real way you win in a race is to run faster yourself. So we regarded ourselves as buying time for the run faster team. And so Chips and Science Act is an example of that kind of like run faster effort. And the jury is still out on how effective this is, but the policy community in theory is focused upon trying to catalyze more and better and faster progress in those respects. My own instincts are that we're more likely to get more out of over time from things like tax policy treatment of innovation and amortization of capital expenditures and R&D funding and things like this, and things like workforce training and development and infrastructure provision to sort of create an environment that is more conducive and that can be used by the private sector in more innovative and dynamic ways, rather than having bureaucrats in Washington decide that this particular industry should get some big subsidy. We're not always very good at picking winners like that. Already under Chips and Science, you've probably seen some coverage. We bet big on Intel, this is the headline just last week. We bet big on Intel, and is it working for us? We don't know yet, right? So we don't want more Cylindras. We want to have a different approach. So there may be, what we do, we know what industrial strategy, industrial policy looks like a la chinoise, and we don't want to do it that way. And by the way, we can't do it that way. We don't want our leaders to have those kinds of authorities. But we don't quite know what industrial strategy a l'Americaine looks like. And so we're building the plane as we fly it. But we're trying, which is a huge change, right?
So a lot of our afternoon has been spent focused on antitrust. What role do you see antitrust playing in trying to foster innovation and helping us run faster? And how does that intersect with some of the other levers that you've described?
I'm not sure we entirely agree with your previous discussants.
That'll make it interesting.
So I think as we think about how this competition will unfold, my perspective is that for U.S. policy, our main effort is in the economic, commercial, and technology space, and we have sort of supporting efforts in the military, in sort of diplomatic and informational spaces, right? So whether we win or lose this thing has to do with how well we do in sort of the economic domain, right? And so then therefore we should then think about like what are the levers that we then have to use in the economic domain to be able to shape the outcome of this. And I think I would put this into sort of three main buckets. One, there is the sort of the bucket of China's access to our market as the world's largest consumer market, right? So we should be very clear, the Chinese economy is still deeply, deeply export dependent. It does not have citizens that are wealthy enough, they have a lot of citizens, but they're not wealthy enough to consume the products China produces. And there is no market in the world that replaces the United States, right? So this idea that China is going to go after the Africa market because it can't get into the US. Well, I'm sorry, Africa can't purchase enough stuff to replace a US market, right? So essentially, we have an asymmetrical advantage in terms of market access. And so then therefore, we sort of think through okay, so what are the tools in that? And that gets down to the same things that both the Trump administration and Biden administration have been using, and it's about tariffs, right? So that access to markets is a way to do that, to be able to shape behavior, commercial behaviors, and an economic outcome. The next category, the next sort of bucket of levers that I would look at is essentially capital flows, right? That's both inbound and outbound investment flows and capital flows. And obviously we saw at the beginning of this week, the Biden administration, and the Biden Treasury Department just issued final rules on outbound investment restrictions in certain key areas, semiconductors, AI, quantum technologies, and we're going to see more of those sorts of things. And obviously, during the Trump administration, passed a bipartisan piece of legislation about reforming CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. So when we think about capital flows both into the United States and out of the United States as it touches China, that's another set of levers. And then the third set of levers is really about our exporting of advanced technologies and components. And that's dual use export controls and other export controls, so controlling where technology and know-how can go, right? So when I look at that, those levers are controlled by various departments and agencies, the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, and then state and DoD have have sort of supporting roles in those things. And that means that the folks that do those things are in those handful of departments and agencies, and they have to have a common strategy about how they're going to do this. And what we've watched over the last, I think, really 8 years is a development of sort of the muscle memory of how you compete in these spaces. And I think that it's interesting to sort of contrast that with sort of muscle memory that's being built to look at this in competitive strategy for like US domestic only activities, right? And the way in which you contrast the things that are happening in sort of a domestic only context of what we saw from the last two speakers and what's happening internationally, right? That to me is the dynamic.
Well, domestic antitrust is it's endogenous. It's focused upon things within our system and breaking up things that are too big and too powerful and that stifle competitive opportunities for their would-be competitors. All of which makes a lot of sense. From a sort of strategic competition perspective in the international arena, we are dealing with challenges from a system that takes that and turns it completely on its head. Like the whole objective of Chinese industrial strategy is to create basically like state champion
World's
monopolists.
5 largest, 5 of the 10 largest banks in the world are Chinese, right? Like so we sort of think about, all the world's largest shipping companies are largely Chinese. Like so, as we sort of think about the various aspects of this, those are the monopolies that we're dealing with.
None of which means I'm against domestic antitrust things. Quite the contrary. There's huge value there. But I do think that at least a factor that should be brought in thinking about those things domestically is to remember that the entities that you're either allowing to stay where they are or breaking up are ones that necessarily exist in a competitive space with entities in China in particular, the entire policy of which revolves around creating, sending companies to be anti-competitive. They're going to the gym, they're taking steroids, they're trying to create these anti-competitive monstrosities to grab market share and push others out and seize what they call the commanding heights of the sort of the new industrial economy. And by the way, by way of history lesson, this goes to what the stakes are, right? Through the prism of how Chinese writers interpret the world, they believe that Britain's first mover advantage in the Industrial Revolution is basically what allowed Britain to make the 19th century Britain's century. So if you were the first mover, you get to take advantage of that sort of supercharging of industrial, economic, and technological power. And oh, by the way, a revolution in military affairs that is associated with every industrial revolution, right? And then the second and third industrial revolutions accrued to the benefit of the United States. The reason that New York is the city that it is because the United States was first mover in the second industrial revolution with heavy industry and oil and that sort of thing, chemistry. And then also first mover advantage for the US in the third industrial revolution, computers and IT and this kind of thing, right? So as Chinese strategists interpret the world, the first 3 industrial revolutions explain why the 19th century ordered itself around Great Britain and why the 20th century and the early 21st century oriented themselves around the United States. And remembering that history is what you need to know when you hear Xi Jinping talk, as he does frequently, about the need for China to seize the commanding heights of the pending 4th Industrial Revolution. So we're not talking just about wanting to be rich and prosperous. We're talking about a vision of what geopolitical consequences of centrality and dominance flow from that first mover advantage. So that's the stakes. And I worry a little bit when we think about our own economic affairs and industrial policy in a bubble that doesn't consider those stakes, whether we should perhaps incorporate at least a little algorithm that worries about that.
And let's get into the weeds for a minute. Any thoughts on how you would recommend translating the international competition perspective into the domestic economic policy world? Mechanically, how should those two sides interact with one another?
Well, I mean, my feeling is, and I've advocated this to my colleagues in the Biden administration, and have written about it numerous occasions, is that first, your political leadership has to acknowledge the reality of what we just described, right? So I want to be very clear when I say this. We are in a new small c, small w Cold War with the PRC, right? We are in that already. It is already unfolding. And what I mean by Cold War is the classic George Orwell definition of Cold War that he coined 2 months after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is that the invention of nuclear weapons and the possession of them by various powers makes countries unconquerable, which means that their competition and their rivalry gets pushed out of the direct military conflict and into every other domain of competition, right? And essentially, when you think about the Soviet-American Cold War, right, and however you visualize that, essentially that is what it was, is that while the United States and the Soviet Union did not go to war directly head-to-head, it pushed the competition and rivalry into every other domain. And the United States primarily won it by focusing on a long-term economic plan in which it gained absolute advantages over the Soviet Union and was able to essentially win that in the long term. And we're in the same dynamic now. And if you don't acknowledge that set of dynamics, it's really hard for your foreign policy and your domestic policy to then get aligned. The way in which we do it in the US system is that you talk about it openly and you let Americans be able to sort of gauge both things directly. But if you allow these things to be separate, right, we have this thing with China, but then we also have this separate thing we have domestically, and they're not interrelated, then you have really contradictions that develop in the way in which you execute policy, right? And that so we have to think about, like, what is the way we do these things? It's that we openly acknowledge them and talk about them openly, and then figure out how do we craft policies together which take into account both things, with the idea that you're going to have to negotiate a settlement between them. And my fear is that we're not doing that. It's certainly not a topic of discussion for either candidate going into this election, but I would contend it is absolutely the most pressing thing that we are facing right now.
But in terms of how the government actually works internally too, right? I mean, in the national security realm, there's sort of the tradition now is you have an administration comes in and they write a national security strategy, and that's supposed to be this kind of overarching guidance document. Excuse me, I'm trying to avoid blowing up the microphone. Overarching guidance document that becomes kind of, as I said before, the commander's intent signal for the other pieces of the bureaucracy. But only the national security pieces read the national security strategy.
Sometimes they don't even do that.
Yeah, sometimes they don't do that. So can you get people together and think in a cross-cutting institutional way so that you have people doing economic policy and, and antitrust and whatever else it is also in the discussion, vice versa. So the national security folks are part of the economic discussions, the economic folks are part of the national security discussions. Doing those both is bureaucratically challenging, but it's certainly not impossible. And the system in theory is designed to do that. That's why we have the centralization of, sort of
you've got a National Economic Council and you have a National Security Council.
They're in the same darn building.
They're in the same building.
And I remember when I was at the National Economic Council, there were certain people who were dual staff.
Dual-hatted, right? So anybody that does international economics, right? So right. we had someone up who was a deputy director of the National Economic Council, right, working domestic policy. But his counterpart that worked international economic issues is dual-hatted underneath the National Security Council, right? That's how we organize it, and you have to be able to discuss those things. So I could be critical of the Biden administration, but I'm going to be sort of judicious and say, I mean, they are accounting for these things. These things are being accounted for, and any administration can be forced to account for these things at the same time.
And there's a congressional piece too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in our system, we have separate institutions sharing powers, as Richard Newstadt's famous axiom had it. And you can't really do any of this successfully without them working to some degree in harmony. And that's why whatever you think of the details of the CHIPS Act and how we're implementing it, and there's some hiccups to be sure, the very fact that you could actually get people to come together across the aisle on something like that and actually put real money into it. I mean, the amount of money probably isn't that much if you're in the TSMC sort of scale of business.
It's about what they spend annually on fabs.
But the symbolism of having done that was really important, and and not just in trivial ways. Like I'm an old Senate staffer for many years, and it's very common for authorizing committees to put lots of big figures in their authorizing bills, but that's just sort of doesn't matter until the appropriators decide what you're going to actually appropriate. They actually put honest-to-God appropriations to some degree in the CHIPS Act, which is extremely unusual and must have been a hell of an inter-committee kind of a dust-up to get it there. So that is a sign that we're starting to focus on this and take it seriously in ways that we really haven't before for a while. That's optimistic. That doesn't mean we succeed. And my description of Chinese policy, of course, doesn't, I don't presume that they succeed either, right? I mean, they're trying to do a world historically weird thing, right? There was not a cabal of British lords and parliamentarians who got together in the 18th century and said, hey, let's plan an industrial revolution so we can have an empire upon which the sun will never set. That didn't happen, right? That's not how this works, right? So, but the
Much
Chinese,
more organic.
yeah, but the CCP thinks it can plan its way to a first mover role in a fourth industrial revolution. That may be a fool's errand. I hope it's a fool's errand. But the jury is still out. They're doing remarkably well.
I'll do my best to make it a fool's errand.
I know, we're working very hard to do that, but we need your help too, right? Because as I said before, the answer of what an industrial policy or a competitive strategy, an innovation strategy answer is to this Chinese challenge. It isn't going to involve people in Washington decreeing how all the pieces of the US private sector are going to move like a flock of swallows in the same direction when you startle them in a field. It's going to involve eliciting cooperation from a million different independent actors with agency, showing that there's a powerful, compelling vision of where to be going together, showing people and being able to demonstrate why this is important and why it works better together, building public-private partnerships, getting the private sector and enlisting people in this sort of collaborative endeavor by choice and by persuasion, not by diktat. That's an American answer to this. It's bloody hard to do, I am sure, but we're starting to feel our way across the, with the old Deng Xiaoping thing, you feel your way across the stream by feeling for the stones, right? So we're starting that process, but we government wonk types can't possibly succeed in this. This is sort of like my distinction between the slow them down versus the run faster. The private sector and the venture cap firms and technology businesses and all this stuff, that's the run faster stuff. And we wonks will do what we can in Washington to make the environment as congenial for that as possible, but you guys have to do it. So please, God, help us out.
I'll ask one more question before opening it up for the audience, but building on what you were saying, Chris, I'm curious, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on, I think no matter which perspective you look at it from, international, domestic, Republican, Democratic, whatever, everyone is oriented around trying to make it easier for American companies to run faster, be innovative, grow the economy. And so I'd be curious from that baseline, how do you both think about the levers that make the most sense to pull for our domestic competitiveness, domestic innovation? Maybe keeping in mind the discussions that we've had thus far today around how to create innovation in this economy.
So I will agree with Lina Khan in one aspect that I think it's important for us to think about. We have a whole bunch of things that privilege incumbents. So how do we think about sort of new entrants coming into the market to be able to sort of shake things up and be able to provide other answers, right? How do we ensure that those kinds of things happen? Because essentially what I think is going to unfold over the next sort of 2 decades is that the pattern of of business plans we've witnessed over the past 2 decades, right, which is essentially, do knowledge work in the United States, conduct manufacturing in essentially one country, and then be able to sort of do labor and regulatory arbitrage through those things to be able to make money, is going to change. So that was all premised on the idea that the United States would have a set of policies in which they're trying to help the Chinese economy grow. That as the US changes to a different set of policies, there are different business models that would be adapted to those new conditions, right? So if we think about Apple's business model is entirely set up around those set of policy conditions that we had established when China entered the WTO, right? That's, Tim Cook is the CEO of Apple now because he was the one that essentially pushed through the whole manufacturing process in China, right? So the model that exists right now for Apple was perfectly adapted for those old conditions. As we get a new set of geopolitical conditions, new business models will arrive, right? So how do we create the space from a government perspective to allow those new things to arise rather than the incumbents stifling them out and preventing those things from happening? I think that's that to me is the tie-in between sort of the things that I work on and the things that I think my domestic policy counterparts are working on, is we have to sort of look at those things. And so which industry sectors would we most want to privilege that happens in, right? I think there's a whole bunch of sort of national security and technology spaces that we should really be focused on. And maybe I don't object to health and all those other things, but But those would be the things that would be very key to me.
Well, in terms of the business models themselves, they don't necessarily have to be completely alien, tear everything up and start from scratch models, right? I mean, one of the challenges that we had is that for a long time, people didn't think about any externalities when making decisions. And they went for the ruthlessly efficient, just-in-time, incredibly fine-tuned, make as much money as possible model. And those are beautiful when they work, but they create, as we saw with COVID, they create brittle ecosystems that don't respond well.
Well, transfers risks onto others.
Yeah,
right.
Well, and they don't handle perturbations, right? Yeah. Because they're optimized for being incredibly fine-tuned, and that's great as long as everything's great. More attention to strategic externalities doesn't mean you have to not involve yourself in global supply chains and fancy, the kind of fancy footwork that set all of that up. It just means that you need to be a little more careful about not getting dependent upon one particular source in one particular player who does not wish you well, right? So I have no objection to globalized, just-in-time, efficient supply chains as long as they don't leave us dependent upon China. So using those same reflexes and those same models and building up connective tissue to other pieces of the world, creating a sort of a non-Chinese centric ecosystem, right? Because China's strategy revolves all around creating hub and spoke relationships. You look at the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, right? This is not a charity project to help the developing world develop. It is it actually avoids building connectivity between smaller developing countries. What it's very good at is building connectivity between a giant hub of China and a little teeny tiny spoke of any given party participant in the BRI, which of course is an asymmetric relationship of dependency. China knows how to build relationships of dependency, and its strategy involves, in many ways, centrally revolves around enmeshing the rest of the world in those kinds of relationships, which it is not shy about manipulating thereafter. We can fight that not by magically assuming we can reshore everything to the United States. Right. Probably can't. I'm not an expert. I'm thinking the answer is probably not. But what we can do is build a series of ecosystems that are just the same kind of like globalized world that we sort of imagined we wanted in the 90s, but just detune the piece of it that gets us dependent upon the PRC. Take advantage of market dynamism and take advantage of all the things that built the really shockingly impressive global economy that is still in place today. But add some strategic wisdom that just makes sure that it's not bloody well dependent upon the CCP.